Michener got a call from Time headquarters saying, "It's a great article, Jimmy Michener, but the Pearl Buck paragraph will have to come out." And the reason the Pearl Buck paragraph had to come out is that Pearl Buck had gone up against Harry Luce during the Second World War, when Luce was America's most vigorous Chiang Kai-shek supporter, and Pearl Buck had dissented from that. So as Michener tells the story, from the Second World War on, Harry Luce was stalking Pearl Buck and would do so to the end of Luce's life. Michener never published the article at all because he refused to publish it without that paragraph celebrating Pearl Buck as an important writer.
In that context, this is the era of the Red Scare and the FBI files, is it not?
Yes. And Pearl Buck got caught up in that to some extent. She has a file that runs to about 300 pages, which is by no means one of the longest files.
Have you seen it?
Oh, yes. Well, I'll put it this way. I don't know how many people in the audience or how many people in this panel have seen an FBI file, but you get FBI files. Well, you could send for your own. You get FBI files under the Freedom of Information Act, and when you get them, you get as many pages as they are willing to part with, and each of the pages in turn may be heavily censored. So of her 300-page file, I've seen about 230 pages, although many of those pages are simply all blacked out. But her file began in 1937 when shall we give a date or two here? She was born in 1892, published The Good Earth, which is her most famous novel, the only one of 70 books she wrote, in 1931, was catapulted to fame with that book, won the Pulitzer, and became one of the best-selling novels of the 30s in 1931, and by 1938 had won the Nobel Prize. So this is a woman who went, as it were, from obscurity to world fame fairly quickly. Her FBI file began at about the time of her world fame in 1937 and continued to the day she died in 1973. So I've seen a lot of that file, but by no means all of it. And I've seen a little more than I was originally given on appeal. But of course you appeal to the same people who gave you the file to begin with, so the appeal is usually not altogether successful. And it's an interesting file because it is filled with evidence, particularly of Pearl Buck's work in American civil rights. She was very active in American civil rights for many years.
She helped develop the NAACP? Is that
well, no. The NAACP goes back to the turn of the century, but when she returned to the United States after living the first 40 years of her life in China, when she returned to the States in the mid-30s for good, permanently, she joined the NAACP immediately and would eventually become a life member. And she eventually served on the board of the Urban League. And she published in both Crisis magazine, which is the magazine of the NAACP, and in Opportunity, which is the magazine of the Urban League. And the FBI was particularly interested in her campaigns against segregation and on behalf of civil rights. And they were also, during the Second World War, attracted by the fact that although she was an advocate for the Chinese in the Second World War, she also was one of the most prominent Americans to speak out against the Japanese internment policy. And so she attracted quite a lot of FBI attention.
I attracted FBI attention when I returned from China. I remember at the Modern Language Association, I found my note on a list where I had been invited and scheduled to interview with an FBI agent. I looked incredulous at it and went through the interview, and he wanted to know about my experience in China and if I would be interested in being an agent. And he gave me an application form.
Are you trying to tell us something? Are you, in fact?
Are you a double agent?
Am I a double agent? No, I hadn't remembered it until this very moment, because it would suggest possibly that because it was a formal exchange that they might have been querying my reasons for having been in China. The U.S.-China People's Friendship Association is strictly a cultural exchange, and what made living in China for me an extraordinary cultural experience was that those boundaries and lines were always clear. They were clear with the professors that I worked with at Fudan University, and they were clarified immediately when I arrived that I was interested in the intellectual activity and in the cultural dance, music, art of the people and their lives. And we got on very well as a result of that, though they disappeared each Friday to go off to the required communist parties. We somehow transcended the differences in our political beliefs in the two cultures. In terms of Nadine Gordimer, for example, as we've headed into heated territory politically, Nadine Gordimer, as an Englishwoman, spent a lot of time in South Africa. When I first came to Philadelphia, Nadine Gordimer was a guest at the University of Pennsylvania, and she read, and there was a reception after, and I was invited to it by a couple of faculty members at Penn. And I hadn't been invited to the dinner, but I got invited to the dinner because Nadine Gordimer invited me to the dinner. And I was extremely impressed by her because she said that she was unimportant in South Africa, or otherwise they never would have permitted her to stay. And that was rather a modest role for her to have seen herself in. How do you think Pearl Buck saw herself in this time? Did she see writing the books that she wrote in literary production in America as being important or unimportant in terms of her communicating about the culture in China?
I think in public she would have taken a fairly modest stance with respect to her own significance. For one thing, she was aware of the fact, as many Americans were not, that she was representing a civilization that goes back 4,000 years, and that even at that time, that is to say in the 1930s, numbered close to 500 million people. So she didn't actually regard herself as representing very much of all of that history and all of those people. On the other hand, in the 1950s, a sociologist did a once famous book. A man named Isaacs did a book called Scratches on Our Mind, which was his attempt to actually quantify where Americans got their impressions of Asia. And so he went around and literally interviewed thousands of people, or had a staff of graduate students interviewing thousands of people, trying to determine what perceptions they had of Asia, since, by the way, back in the 50s, very few Americans, except those servicemen that had been in the Pacific War, had been to Asia. Few certainly in peacetime, and practically none to China specifically. And in any case, to get to the punchline, what Isaacs and his graduate students discovered is that by a 3-to-1 margin over any other source, Americans had gotten their image, whatever it was, of China directly from Pearl Buck, and specifically from the one novel, The Good Earth. Now that's no longer true. TV and movies and even travel have become a lot more possible than they once were, and people get their impressions much more diversely. I'm not sure they get much more reliable impressions from television than they used to get from Pearl Buck. But for a couple of generations, I think the claim could be made that Pearl Buck practically invented China for Americans. So from that perspective, she was quite significant. Americans have been only intermittently interested in Asia. You know, we tend to get interested when there's a revolution or a war of some sort, trouble, trade competition.
Right.
What she did was to, at least for a long period of time, from the 30s through the 50s, provide Americans with a relatively readable, often entertaining, but in many ways fairly reliable and certainly well-informed source of information about ordinary life, ordinary people, often agricultural kinds of people, farming people.
Right.
A couple of her books are set among middle-class families, but usually it's agricultural families. So she played an important role, perhaps more important than she would have acknowledged in public.
Right.
Do you think there's a reassessment being regenerated, so to speak, coming up as far as her book and or books that she has written, and sort of the perception that we have of China today, which is kind of false in a way because we only get it from a
we hear the
from
bad
their
news.
PRs.
We hear the bad news.
Yeah.
I think Peter's book is probably going to accomplish that task.
Maybe this will help make the reassessment, huh?
Right, yes, this book, which will be soon available at the handsome and attractive price of $29.95 at your local bookstore. James's question, whether there's a reassessment, let's say of Pearl Buck, would be better answered. Oh, thank you, that's so nicely done. It's a nice photograph of Pearl Buck from the 1930s. Pearl Buck's reputation, of course, went into sharp decline for a good many years. And I think the evidence of this book, of the TV documentary from which the clips we just saw themselves were taken, of a couple of radio programs, European radio programs on which I have also appeared in the last couple of years, another book about Pearl Buck, which came out about 2 years ago. All of them are perhaps evidence of a renewed interest in this very interesting woman who's, at a minimum, whose long life, 80 years, half of them lived in China, half in the United States, is an uncommonly interesting story. As you got, again, a sense from the film clips, she lived through revolution, she lived through civil war, a person who went from poverty to the Nobel Prize in a relatively short period of time, who went therefore from obscurity to world fame in a short period of time, who played a fairly significant role in American civil rights and women's rights movements, all of which I could detail at incredible length.
And which
and which the book does, yes, at extraordinary length. So I think there may be a renewed interest in at least taking another look at this woman. And is it time for me to mention the play?
Certainly, Peter.
Go right ahead. Go for it.
Which the play has, because of Peter's book, there has been already, James, he's going to tell us about it, a stimulus to reconsiderations and probably re-representations of her in other forms and in other media in our culture. So please do tell us.
The actress Valerie Harper has commissioned a one-actress play based on the book called The Dragon and the Pearl, which is scheduled to open in California in July. And I've read the script, and I'm of course quite pleased with it. The script has a fairly close relationship to the book, which explains part of my pleasure. But I'm also pleased because it does indicate again that there is a certain amount of renewed interest in this interesting woman.
It also will not only represent Pearl Buck, but recreate her in the monologue of Valerie Harper. I love plays that do this in particular. There's been the reproduction of, well, Edith Wharton has had a revival in this sense, and a reassessment and a kind of industry in the canon, and a reincorporation into the academic university curriculum. And as a result, it has been played in theater, in monologues, and it very well could be that Pearl Buck, as she is in this internationalism in which we find ourselves, going to play a role in helping us understand China today.
Well, she also, James Michener, when he spoke with me about Pearl Buck, and he did once a couple of years ago, pointed out that if you followed in her wake, he said, as he, Michener, did, you found yourself encountering virtually every interesting social and political question of the 20th century, from internationalism to cross-culture to women's rights to civil rights.
Right,
to
let's
the question
stop
of
there.
Children. Yeah.
One of the reasons why Edith Wharton was not taken so seriously and Pearl Buck were not taken so seriously is that they, in part, chose domesticity as the venue for the most the action in the book, kind of family setting and the interactions of births and deaths that seemed a bit prosaic without the hard edge of perhaps more, well, what would you say, of other subjects?
Yes, Pearl Buck.
Is there a women's kind of writing that is going on with Pearl Buck and with Edith Wharton that caused them to have
When I was writing the book, I was in contact with 150 different libraries and archives around the United States. At least a dozen of those librarians and archivists, either over the phone or in letters to me, told me that Pearl Buck was their mother's favorite writer. Fathers were never mentioned. And it certainly is the case. Whatever the ultimate assessment of the value of her fiction, and those things are very difficult to determine, she ran into some trouble because she became known early on and permanently as a, quote, woman's writer. You can read that in the old reviews, starting as early as the 1940s. And I think the fact that she did focus a lot of her attention on precisely on domestic activities, that some of her most interesting scenes are marriages and births and deaths and so on, is of some importance.
No.
Yes, I understand. Yeah. It's also interesting to me that she became an admirer of Edith Wharton's back in the 40s before Edith Wharton caught on with other people.
Pearl Buck?
Pearl Buck became an admirer.
Did she know about Virginia Woolf, too?
I don't know what she knew about
did not
Virginia
like Edith
Woolf. I do know that in 1941, when Pearl Buck's collection of essays of men and women, a collection of feminist essays, was published, the New York Times said it was as important as Virginia Woolf's feminist essays. But that's another of the dimensions of Pearl Buck's work that has, until this book,
what year was
erased.
it?
1941. 1941. On the eve of the Second World War.
Well, we've touched on the relation to the missionaries and the relation to politics, the relation to women's rights, a relation to the sort of historical context. Perhaps we should explore some of the wider dimensions. Pearl Buck, and perhaps turn to Meredith for a moment. What do we find out about Pearl Buck from the home? What is the view of her house at the Foundation as a museum? Is it approached as a literary house, or as a house of a humanitarian, or is it a combination of both? Or
perhaps the viewer is unaware that part of the Foundation's property, and actually on the property in Bucks County, is the house that was built in 1835, which Pearl Buck restored and expanded, and is now on the National Historic Register.
Yes.
And people tour and can tour. We have something like 15 to 20,000 people a year come to visit the house. I think people are primarily interested in the person, in the woman. I was at a dinner party last night in Washington, and someone said the same thing to me. My mother loved her and knew all about her. So we get a lot of people who are very much interested in her as a person. People love to come and see the room where the Nobel Prize is, so they're very interested. And also her library. She has an amazing collection of books. So people come to look at the Pulitzer Prize, to look at the Nobel Prize, to enjoy the antiques, because there's so much of China and of Asia throughout the house.
I always admire the textiles. There's a wonderful dragon robe, which I'm told she never wore. But there is this extraordinary closet of the gowns, which she used to put on, as you can imagine her sitting in her bedroom and writing her stories each day. I always particularly like those. Also, you meet the people she met. She had spent considerable time in India on her holidays when she was in China, and you do feel Pearl Buck come alive. You also get to go through her kitchen and hear about the wonderful organic vegetables that she used. There is a Pearl Buck cookbook. In that connection, Susanna Fu in Philadelphia, it's one of the finer Chinese restaurants in all of America, has just issued a cookbook. And I told Suzanne I would mention her book along with Pearl S. Buck's cookbook.
You've got that in there, near the copy, under the chair.
And there are many facets to Pearl S. Buck, which we've touched on in many ways. The contribution that she makes is different than a travel writer. Many of the views and perceptions that Americans have are probably based on Mark Saltzman's Iron and Silk, Mary Morris's Wall to Wall, Paul Theroux's Iron Rooster, Orville Schell's nonfiction, his commentaries on China. Peter, a tough question. Where do you think the most famous of Pearl Buck's books, The Good Earth, and the one that our mother acted in, Katharine Hepburn, and chose to act as a Chinese woman in it, in that generation, as Valerie Harper is choosing now to be Pearl Buck. How do you think that helps us understand the Chinese today? Liu Haiping, who is the foremost Eugene O'Neill scholar, he also was not cited on the film and has been at the University of Pennsylvania, right?
Yes.
And I met him, I had dinner with him when I was in Nanjing. He's a wonderful scholar. And he feels that the Chinese themselves learn about another era from Pearl S. Buck.
Yes.
Whereas I, as a visitor to China, find that there still remains in the countryside a lot of the land, the type of environment she described previously.
Partly the point Liu Haiping is making is that Chinese fiction itself neglected the very subjects that Pearl Buck wrote about. And so that indeed it is his claim as a Chinese scholar that the only source he can go to for at least some of the information about Chinese rural life, fictionalized reliably at the turn of the century, which is when she primarily set her books, is Pearl Buck.
Because Dream of the Red Mansion certainly covers a different group of people in Chinese
Yes, a different group of
society.
people and much earlier.
The Last
That's
Empress.
Right. That's right.
We're going to have to
come to some final words?
Yes.
Already.
Yes, it goes so fast.
Meredith, can you tell us what's happening at the Pearl Buck Foundation that's most exciting now? Your move.
We don't even want to talk
15
about
seconds.
that. Each year we give an award as part of her legacy. And this year on May 13th, Hanan Ashrawi of the Palestinian Peace Talk fame is going to be the recipient of that award. Another in the long line of women of definition with whom we celebrate Pearl's legacy.
One of the most fascinating things I found in connection with that is that there's an opening of the Pearl Buck camp in Gaza. It's one of the first collaborations with the Audrey Hepburn Educational Enhancement Center. And Peter, we've heard about Valerie Harper and the book.
And the book. If I have 15 more seconds, I'll tell you about the book again. Cambridge University Press, July or August.
Do I have a couple of minutes?
No. You have 10 seconds.
It's all over. I hope you've enjoyed this insight into China, that you'll look at Peter's book when it comes out and reassess and learn about Pearl S. Buck, that you'll visit her beautiful home in Bucks County and the Michener Museum, and that these entrees into Chinese life and this discussion that we've had this evening will help reshape some impressions to add dimension to those reports that we get about the IMF and human rights in China, and give you a wider, more human view of the people there.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, James.
Okay. Good night, and we'll see you in a month.
The N.A.P. Connection is produced through Berks Community Television and can be seen live on the fourth Tuesday of each month at 9 p.m. Consult your local community cable service for live and repeat programming. For more information about the New Arts program and its consultation residencies of artists from the literary, visual, and performing arts, call 683-6440 or write New Arts Program, P.O. Box 82, Kutztown, PA 19530, or visit the office and exhibition space at 173 West Main Street, Kutztown, PA. Hours are Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday 1 to 5, Saturday 10 to 2, or by appointment.